Joining us from the UK and across Europe, and good afternoon to those joining us from North America, be this Canada or the US. I'm Maurice Evelyn-Buffton. I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. I'm delighted to have an enriched panel today to be talking around the evolution of technology and behavioral science, etc., as a component part or an evolving tool to further support the COO in their endeavors to help shape culture and meet the challenges around conduct. This is webinar number 14, I think, over the day 2. In total, this is 3 days, our annual Conduct and Culture Summit. This year, it's titled Purpose Over Profit. We've really investigated 3 areas. One is around the role of leadership and purpose and culture. Secondly, tomorrow is more around about the governance and the specific role of the COO and the Chief Control Officer. And today's been really looking at what tools are available for the COO and their partners in relation to moving forward on the challenges around meeting the challenges of culture and purpose and conduct, the 3 siblings as really defined by the FCA. Before passing to Patrick to actually set the scene, I'm just going to do some roundtable introductions. Andrew, first to you, sir.
Hello, I'm Andrew McDonald. I'm founder of PQ Elbro, which is a company that analyzes physiological data in executives using elite sports science, and also offers a technology platform to integrate that alongside IQ and EQ data to support executive performance in the workplace.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Nick.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Reed. I'm representing Starling Trust today. I'm a former global product COO and regional COO with HSBC.
Thank you, Nick. Mark.
I'm close to on from Nick. Likewise, I'm working and supporting Starling around its predictive behavioural technology. Just prior to that, I was at HSBC as a group head of operational risk.
Thank you, Mark. Patrick.
Good evening and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Patrick Butler, and I'm the managing partner for Armstrong Wolf Institute, where we're looking to bring together a number of solutions to help the COOs enhance their role within the industry. I had a previous career as a diplomat, then as a banker, M&A banker, an operating officer, both with HSBC, and then I worked with Bank of America Merrill Lynch in the risk platform, including building a compliance function, before spending the last 8 years working with banks to bring behavioral models to underpin a better performance on all fronts, to drive culture, conduct, and values within the organization in response to the changing regulatory agenda after the last financial crisis.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll hand it back to you, Patrick. The conversations we've had over the last two days, and just before we went live, is that the view is that actually the industry as a whole is from a first line controls and governance and then into second line has come to some point of feeling the steady state business as usual. And it's as if the industry is on the whole met the obligations set by the regulators around controls and putting in processes to meet the challenge around conduct. And now at this point, it's more about the COO is to more look forward to going from hindsight to foresight, how to get on anticipatory footing. So this session is right at the heart of that debate in relation to what tools are available for the COO to actually then take that step and then start to pivot their attentions forward. Patrick, I'm going to hand the baton to you, sir.
Thank you, Maurice. Well, again, let's put it in context. And much of the discussion that we've had over the last day and a half, almost 2 days, has really highlighted the opportunity that there is, as you say, foresight. That if we get a deeper understanding and an ability to manage conduct and culture, and we put it together with purpose, we can actually drive long-term sustainable value in the firm. Much of this has come out of the experiences during COVID when people have stepped up. We've seen some areas where it's been very difficult. As managers have recognized that mindset and behavior have been what's really driven value. And the absence of it may have actually caused firms to struggle. So much of the discussion has been, well, how do we bring purpose, conduct, and culture to work for us as an organization? And although the theory is there and the understanding that good behavior is good business, how do we actually make those connections? And so what we're going to try to do is dig down into that today. And if I just give you a couple of examples just to set the scene, I'm just going to share a couple of wee slides to just put those pointers out there. So one of them is that human capital is variable in performance. We know that, but it provides the most potent element for the finance industry. So we rely on people to perform. We learn very effectively by example rather than policy. So through training, through experience, and by watching our colleagues and those that we respect or we think are successful. So decision making and performance are also based on our internal and external environment. The external environment, the culture, gives us the signals as to how we should behave, and that is driven by how everybody behaves in aggregate. So we watch all the signs. And then there's the internal driving force. Some of these we went into a bit more detail yesterday in terms of bias and personal aspiration and so on. But when we look at the internal, there are elements such as your stress, your mood, your bias, your internal biases, and your health that drive what decision making you make. And that includes your performance in an organization. Externally, obviously, observed signs of culture. So with all of these variables, capacity and therefore the potential performance can really vary. And what we're trying to look at is what can the COO do to optimize this and then focus it in the interest of the firm's purpose. The regulator has a position, and one of those is that they recognize this concept of behavior at risk, a bit like value at risk, in that the behavior can change from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute, depending on the circumstances. And with that in mind, to what extent can firms use behavioral analytics? This is the question, to understand it, to measure it, to read it, and therefore to help manage it in the best way possible to get the best performance out of the organization, the people, who are the individuals who make up that organization. And if they do that, again, what we can do is we can see that when we invest in behavior, for an example, and this comes from a model that we talked about in one of the sessions yesterday, a financial model for one firm to take the investment in behavior and conduct and values, show what the return would be over a 7 to 10 year period and the impact it had on the performance of the organization, we could see a return of 25 to 40% per annum. And this had conservative discounts heavily applied to it because of the indirect approach to it. But it has a real impact, and a lot of the conversations have recognized this. So the key thing, and this is where the COOs have said this, well, so what? What can we actually do? Where are the tools, and how do we incorporate them into our operating model in order to make a difference? And that's I think is where we're going to go in the next 20 minutes, half an hour.
Thank you very much, Pat. I'm now going to hand to Mark and Nick to take us through their own individual journeys and actually to the point where they are now senior advisors to Starling Trust. That you might actually help, Mark, if you could just give us some overview of Starling Trust itself before that. And then hopefully looking at how you see technology can actually address some of the inherent challenges that are already embedded in the industry. Mark, if I could hand to you, sir.
Certainly. Thanks, Ross. Well, so let me probably scene set a little bit. For me, I confess that I was relatively new to predictive analytics, reg tech, risk tech in general, certainly in 2018, when I bumped into Starling through a serendipitous set of introductions. I'd probably argue that from the perspective of being exposed to behavioral science that I had encountered initially through sort of organizational behavioral theorem, but more latterly, I suppose, in terms of the role that I performed, my view really increasingly over time was that influencing behavior is the most fundamental thing you can do to get better risk management outcomes. And that particularly applies in the operational stroke non-financial risk space. You can put in your processes, you can put in your systems and practices, and they will provide you with structure, but the outcomes are very much dependent on fostering those behaviors of awareness, curiosity, active risk management, and in many ways, actually teaming, people coming together. And I agree with Patrick wholeheartedly when he said that, these behaviors are learned. what makes us operate in a certain way, the way that we decision, the way that we act. Behavior is very much learned. They're almost contagious, and they're set by the people around us, and they're often set by how we see leadership work, but they're also set by in terms of how our co-workers and peers work around us. So when I was approached by Starling, I said, look, we use data, we use meta operating data that's freely available in the organization. We apply behavioral science, and we use computational social science to really help you decode and understand that human system, the human systems that is at play. And that's interesting. And that's particularly interesting when you think of it in the context of HSB. This is a huge interconnected organization. It's a very complex operating organization. And trying to understand how that human system plays out and how the teaming takes place, and where there are strength relationship versus where there is a lack of strength, like a trust, where we see inclusion versus where we see exclusion, where we see teams that work well together, where we see teams that don't work well together. Being able to observe that on a real-time basis and to look at that in relation to some of the other operating data that we have available to us in terms of outcomes, the level of customer satisfaction, the level of sales performance, the level of payment failures that we may see, the level of outages. By bringing that understanding of that human system together with the understanding of how the organization operates, it presents the opportunity to become quite predictive around where we see teams working in a certain way. We can forecast where we're going to see outcomes. We're going to see outcomes that are either good and beneficial, or outcomes that are undesired. So that led to an engagement, really, that was the basis for an engagement really with Starling, was to see how these tools would work in practice. And in the study that we made and the initiative that we embarked upon, it for me was to just try to understand how that human system played out in relation to the expected risk management that we would see and we would observe through the processes and systems put in place. So the relationships that we would expect to find between risk owners, controllers, and chief control officers, the relationships that we would expect to find between the specialist risk stewards, the second line, and how they work together with the first line. And what we sought to do was simply say, okay, let's look at we understand in theory how we expect the organization to operate, but how is it actually operating in reality? And that was in effect the analytics that we brought to bear, and the understanding. And that was, from my perspective, that really started to highlight the way that predictive behavioral technology and computational science could be used in practice. And I was very fortunate that my colleagues and in this instance Nick, as well as the chief operating officer, very keen to engage along the same lines to sort of explore how this technology could be used and how it could be used actually to help run our businesses in a better way. And maybe Nick, that's a good segue for me to hand the baton to you to say about your experience in terms of working with the Starling initially as part of HSBC.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I met Starling similarly a couple of years ago at a fintech Hive in Dubai, and was very interested by the potential that this kind of tool that Starling uses could offer to the COO community. I've managed in a startup firm, and I've also managed in a large institution like HSBC. And I've managed small teams and very large teams as well. And as Mark and Patrick have said, the dynamics between people and the behaviors that people display is the key to unlocking value as well as managing risk. And I think that's what excites me about Starling, and also this golden age of computational social science, if you like. I mean, the amount of data that people leave behind in their digital footprints now, either deliberately or accidentally, is vast. And once you combine that with the computing power that's now available and apply machine learning techniques with the behavioral science, then the opportunities are huge. And then when you combine it with social science, social network science as well, then it becomes really very powerful, and as Mark says, can start to be predictive. And I think what's interesting as well is that this isn't just about conduct and culture. This is not just about, you know, catching the bad guys. As Patrick says, there's a huge amount of value to be unlocked here. And what I think is interesting is using this technology and this computational social science to start to shrink the haystack, as it were, right? So really be able to, as a manager, to be able to have a guide or an indicator in advance as to where stress points are going to move past being stressed and actually break. You know, as a COO, and maybe I'll confess too much now, but I can because I'm not a COO anymore. You know, there would be days that you'd come into work and not know which part of the operation was going to blow up, but some part, you know, pretty often would. And then it would be all hands to the decks to manage that crisis. And that would distract from, you know, other work, and it would just be a firefighting, you know, session until it was fixed and it was understood. So having something that would give you an indicator in advance of areas that were showing signs of stress or areas that were working better than other areas, to give you time to say, right, this is where I need to focus my time, feels incredibly powerful and, you know, really, really useful. So I think that you know, that's what excited me about Starling and drew me towards working closely with Starling, and, you know, combining with Mark with his second line experience and bringing my kind of first line experience, then you know, it really brings the full kind of like package. I think as leaders, you know, it's kind of incumbent on us to, you know, acknowledge these new tools and embrace the data in order to manage resources efficiently. And it's about, you know, understanding the dynamics of trust, you know, psychological safety, inclusion, and all those behavioral science aspects that can be unlocked with the power of the data. And it's that kind of predictive behavioral analysis that a technology firm like Starling can really bring to the market using the technology that it does now.
Thanks, Nick. Can I just then ask, just to contextualize this, it's interesting we've got the voice of the second and the first line singing on the same song sheet, because we're fully aware of the inherent embedded challenges between first and second line duplication of effort, and the second line being accused of putting on the advisory hat, and the first line saying, you know, having an increasing book of work with a decreasing headcount to meet it. Where do you see this technology fitting in? Is it complementary to established surveillance systems? Does it replace? You know, where do you actually see this? So if I'm a COO out there of either large or a small franchise, going, okay, so where am I going to plug and play this, or can I plug and play this in relation to what I've already got?
Maurice, that's a really good question, and maybe I'll kick off and then Nick can wade in with the view of the representation of the actual risk managers themselves. From a second line perspective, what was interesting about this technology was that it was not surveillance. Surveillance turns me off for many reasons. Certainly, when you start to look and apply across the entire organization, I accept that in certain regulated roles, in certain very sensitive roles in market making in the front office, that there is a necessity to ensure that we guard and ensure that those markets operate well by effectively, you know, observing in a more providing more scrutiny. But you've also, for an organization to work, you need trust, and you need a trust between management and its employees, and leadership and its employees. And trust is not fostered through surveillance. And so the idea that you would actually spy on an individual and look at what they were doing and look at their content that they were providing, that to me, you know, that to me has more downside than it has upside. I think it undermines in terms of how these human capital organizations should work. What the technology that we're using in computational social science seeks to do is it just uses the metadata, the patterns of connectivity and the frequency to get a sense of the strength of the bonds and a sense of who's talking to who, and how and how those conversations and how those connections are taking place across an entire end-to-end system. And that in many ways is what we see in a modern organization, that it's really hard to observe work and make sense of what's going well versus what's not going well. It's not hard in the traditional sort of organizational view when you physically come into a building and physically everybody is there. But in today's organization, and particularly, through this pandemic, we are now seeing virtual work environments. We're seeing people who previously used to work together are now distributed into their home office. But then we always had teams that were working across floors, teams that were working across countries in order to make these operations work. And you kind of want to know how well are all those various individuals and the teams they work with, how well are they connecting? And are we seeing the type of collaboration that would lead to good outcomes? And I think that's really where, I think these tools have value, is that at scale, they can start to help the leader and start to help the manager augment their view as to where things are working well versus where things are not working well, so they can proactively engage. It doesn't tell you something bad's happening. It tells you there is some sort of anomaly. It tells you that in the past, where we've seen this type of situation, it can lead to bad outcomes. So it's about providing leverage. It's about providing augmentation. It's not AI in the sense of it's making a decision for you. It doesn't do that. It's helping the manager to apply their scarce resources and expertise in areas where you can get the best outcome.
Yeah, I'd agree wholeheartedly. So tools like this are for first line and second line. They're for people who are managing people. They're for people who are managing processes. And Starling in particular is about what I would call kind of throughputs, or the network, right? The ebb and flow of information and the patterns of how people interact with each other to do their jobs. There's plenty of tools out there for looking at kind of inputs, right? So personality tests, or sentiment analysis, or ethics training, and they're all valuable, right? So I'm not saying they're not valuable at all. There's plenty out there that are focusing on outputs as well, which would be surveillance, reviewing process, failures, assurance and review, and again, all kind of valuable. I think what Starling brings is looking at the dynamic network, right? The ongoing interaction between first and second line, between trading and operations, between sales and trading, between one trading desk and another trading desk, between regions. This is, all the firms that we work in are social networks. They are complex, but they are, they can be analyzed. And this, as I said earlier on, this is not necessarily about honing in on individual behavior, but understanding how the social dynamic, how the social network works to create an end result that everybody is either pulling for or pulling against. And it gives you the tools and the insight to be able to, nudge or push the culture in the direction that you want it to go. But also, as Mark has kind of said, give you some insight on, where stresses are going to occur, and where you could, spend some time focusing your efforts.
So Maurice, you asked about a shift between the first and second. I think the problem that many banks and insurers and financial services at large has found themselves in is that while we're seeing our businesses go digital, risk management is still quite analog. It's still quite inspection, insurance, point in time. It needs to go digital. It actually, these tools are much, much better when they're deployed right where the action is, right in the first line, and they're used in the first line for the real risk managers to manage the risk, because they're closest to these businesses, they're closest to their customers, and they know what good business looks like. And so we should be, a second line, our role is to champion and collaborate with the first line to provide these type of tools to make this much more embedded, much more real time, and therefore much more proactive and valuable, versus the extremely labor intensive way that we've seen in the past, where everything is about checking and inspecting. And that's giving, that may be necessary to some degree, but there's diminishing return from that.
So I'm going to come on to Andrew in a minute, but I think that point of checking the checklist, for example, is a well-known phrase. So where did the two of you envisage 5 years hence, for example, the art of the possible relation to where technology is now, but how do you envisage your dashboard in 5 years' time? If you embrace the technologies that are available and the further evolution over the next 5 years, in which Starling Trust is at the forefront of that evolution. Nick, you go back into banking, global COO. What do you envisage is actually possible in relation to having your dashboard, in relation to identifying these behavioral traits and being on a anticipatory footing and looking forward, as opposed to actually the granularity around surveillance alerts, etc., and etc. Where do you see that we're heading?
So in my mind's eye, I'd like to imagine, as you say, some kind of dashboard, and if it's, red, amber, green, then, so be it. But some kind of dashboard that's giving me an indication of, depending on how I want to cut the kind of like the cube, by department or by, opera process or by region, an indication of, psychological safety within that particular area, how teams are feeling, with regard to inclusion or exclusion, how the trust dynamic is working within those teams. So, initially to give me a kind of a sense of a broad sense of well-being around the operation, front to back across the social network within the area that I'd be responsible for. And then I'd also, expect and, can fully imagine a dashboard where, there would be indicators saying, as Mark hinted out earlier on, and this is doable now, where there are indicators saying, we are seeing patterns in communication and we're seeing patterns in behavior that are, not normal or are indicating that previous events that happened in the past and displayed similar patterns might be about to happen again. And that gives me, an opportunity to go, right, I'm going to spend a bit of time with this team or focus on that process before anything bad goes. Or, and think about it in the positive light as well, if there's a process or an area that's displaying really positive, signs, then that also might be an area where I want to focus on, because I need to understand, well, what is it about that team or that process or that dynamic that is working so well? It'd be great to understand that so that I can try and replicate it elsewhere. So that kind of, dashboard, and, these dashboards and this insight can be, useful for supporting employees, right, as we've talked about, but equally for supporting, customers. I mean, a lot of the interaction of sales teams with each other when they're supporting customers, sales teams with trading teams when they're supporting customers as well. Equally valuable insights is there as well. And then, of course, supporting the shareholders, trying to, see the likely operational losses before they happen, right? And try and get in front of them before they happen and meet the regulators' demand, right? Which is to try and start to manage with foresight. So it's that kind of, I don't know whether it's like a blinking, dashboard. Ideally, everything's flashing kind of like green, stuff starts to flash amber, and I'm like, okay, this is where my focus is going to be today, with the ideal scenario that nothing ever goes red. But I'm an optimist.
Can I put it into context to some of the conversations that we've had elsewhere in this? And it is very exciting. A lot of people have said there's no silver bullet, and there isn't. And you ask sort of where does this sit alongside? And it absolutely is another layer, a deeper layer of leading indicators into what is likely to happen that give you greater insight that allows you to ask deeper questions. As you said, you don't know if that pattern necessarily is going to lead to good or bad or something, but you can start to critique it because you have the information. So you can see if a particular team has stopped talking to each other and you've got a little cabal of 3 people talking, could be plotting, whatever it might be, but it could be that they're planning a piece of innovation that could come out well. But it gives you that, if you like, that insight into what's going on. Now, in terms of what for the COO, and in all the things we've been talking about, in building a framework for managing culture, it is one of the absolutely critical tools to build measures of behavior that allow you then to see trends, but also then to react, to communicate, to reward the right sort of behavior. to make it clear what is not acceptable and what is really acceptable, what contributes towards the purpose. So you can build that framework of the drivers, the behaviors that underpin the values, which underpin the strategy, which underpin the purpose. And you've got in some ways possibly the missing piece of the puzzle. As many people have talked about the right behaviors with the right purpose, but how do you then ensure that you get the right behaviors? How can you help managers who are on the spot make decisions and run their teams and manage people, human beings, in the right way in order to not to be picking up the pieces at the end, but actually to be guiding and gearing and steering towards the right sort of approaches that are going to create that sustainable value and avoid the operational losses.
So Patrick, I think you're right, and certainly these type of tools can bring in a level of organizational wide analysis to understand, the extent of how the efforts to create the right working environment and the right type of culture are shaping out over time. And the thing about using a data-driven view is you get a data-driven view every day. Where I actually get excited, and particularly if I think to the challenge that Nick faces as Chief Operating Officer, is in some ways it's often the more directed dashboards that I could see being used over time, and certain things that we're looking at with our clients. And that's where you really start to not look at the human system in isolation, but you look at the human system in relation to the commercial elements of what the organization is trying to do. You look at it in relation to your key services, your critical services. The team that should be involved in those critical services, and you have a set of operational health metrics associated with those critical services. And what we're layering on is now that imaging around the human system, the psychological safety, the inclusion, the trust, and arguably, and it's quite topical at the moment, the overall resilience of that system. Are you burning your people out? Are we showing signs of working patterns and the nature of the way that people are working there would suggest that we're going to get high attrition, or that we're going to basically cause a failure through the fact that we're overusing the capacity. And it's having that view lined up alongside the operational metrics of a given business and seeing it in that business context and seeing it end to end, I think lifts an operating officer's view and an operating officer's insight to a very, very different level. And it lets them run their commercial operations in a more effective way. And that's very much a directed view. Now, there are hidden views that you gain from that in terms of which can equally be interesting and can give you insight. But much of this is often about how you seek to maximize performance and minimize the potential for downside and for things going wrong.
That's a perfect segue to Andrew, I think, isn't it?
So you talk about fatigue, etc., and I was thinking that's the perfect segue to Andrew. I think the point here, though, is that the key point here is seeing this technology as equally potentially more as an enabler of commercial benefit as opposed to a technology that's looking at preventative measures. I think the automatic default is when you go, oh, is this just another step, another thing to actually identify? And then you think about the commercial investment in there, they say, well, how much, we've invested millions in surveillance, and how much actually, what's exactly the return on that? And I think the pivot is the lead this is made. We look in the commercial case for good conduct, or the commercial case for this investment is almost leading with it in relation to, this is to identify, I think Patrick, you said, there's a team of 3 that actually are having a entrepreneurial conversation about something that's going to be productive and enhancing as opposed to something that's colluding, for example. I think that's the messaging of this behavioural tech, that it's not about just catching the thief, is it? It's about sort of identifying positivity and actually how you channel and focus on that. You talked about fatigue. I think this is when we talked about this isn't the silver bullet or nirvana, but it's an interesting component part of the future and on Nick's dashboard. When we looked at other technologies that could look at the same challenge, but from a different angle. Andrew, that's like where I'd like to bring you in, Andrew, to talk from your perspective and actually how it could be complementary to what, say, Mark and Nick and Starling Trust could bring to a bank or asset manager or the industry.
Sure. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some slides with you. Bottom line, I'm going to talk about people, and I'm going to talk specifically about physiology. You're all familiar with IQ and EQ, and Nick mentioned the multiple psychometric measures and the like. But I have a background. I had 20 years in investment banking, latterly as an MD at Merrill's. I left in 2005 and have been an executive coach since then, working with executives without a physiological lens, without being able to assess how their physiology is impacting their decision making and their capacity to be productive, which is where the concept for PQ came, and where we have developed some perspectives I hope you find interesting. So here we go. Start the show. So we call this the third dimension of executive performance, and there is a definition. We're partnered with Loughborough University, who are #1 in the world for sports science, because sports science is where physiology is best understood and measured. It's scientifically validated indicator of an individual's executive performance potential defined by their essential body system. So what we're interested in is a gap analysis of performance and potential capacity, which links with some of the conversations we've already had. And fundamental to this is the concept of homeostasis. The human body is driven by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which form our autonomic nervous system. We are constantly recalibrating to the environment which stimulates and calms us. The sympathetic nervous system lifts our performance. It's the stress response, and the parasympathetic calms us. And we operate within parameters, hopefully. But when we talk about risk and human risk, this space of disease is where fatigue and ultimately burnout and breakdown manifests itself if we don't manage our nervous system accurately. And one of the things that executives have never done is measure this. It's everywhere in elite sport and nowhere in the executive world. And this is how we like to visualize it. Performance in a human being is driven by increments, driven by stress, which is not a negative feature unless it is excessive and not compensated for. But what is observed in executives and performance athletes is if there is excessive stress and pressure without compensating recovery, you have an accelerated decline through emotional and ultimately cognitive breakdown. And our PQ proposition is if you manage stress actively with recovery and optimal strategies, there is no need to break down and collapse down the other side of the hill. What you do is you create a floor from which then a trampoline effect works, and you can push performance upwards because there is not this recovery from exhaustion required. So that 2-week holiday where everything's going to be resolved, that is an ongoing 52-week-a-year practice. So I just want to show you some data which you might find interesting. We use a research grade device to measure heart rate variability, which is the best proxy for the performance of the body systems and the autonomic nervous system that is used currently by elite sport to monitor elite athletes. You'll find all Olympians are doing this right now. And this is the data from 2 executives. They're actually 2 equity investors at one of the largest global asset managers last year. On the same day, same sort of level. And the red bars are stress, measurable stress, when the sympathetic nervous system is dominant. The blue bars here are exercise, so moderate exercise, and the green bars are recovery. And what you can see is 2 very different profiles. Executive 1 has not a minute of recovery during that whole working day. So they are sympathetically dominant throughout. This is not an unusual profile. We've been profiling in a major Big 4 bank in the UK, US investment banks, US and global investment managers, and actually a government owned bank as well. And what we've found is very similarly, many executives have not the habits of generating recovery during the day. Executive 2 generates a lot of recovery. About 30% of their day is parasympathetically dominant. And of course, the question is, what are they doing? And the truth is, it's very different from person to person. For some people, it can be reading a book or a magazine. For many executives, it can be doing their work. For an introspective individual, doing their work privately and uninterrupted can generate a recovery response. For an extrovert, a cup of coffee with a friend can have the same impact. So it's different from person to person. But watch the next slide. This is their night's sleep after those 2 days. Executive 1, who has been stressed all day, this person is unconscious when we're measuring here, but during this period, they are sympathetically dominant and stressed. And it takes until 4 in the morning for them to generate any measurable recovery physiologically through the night. Executive 2, lots of healthy recovery from the moment of unconsciousness. Now, you cannot see this as a manager optically, because this is not something you're trained for, and this is not something that is prioritized in organizations. But this is happening with every single executive in your purview. Somewhere within these boundaries is happening every day. And the question is that a risk factor? Now, for you as COOs, I don't know, but from me as an executive coach, I'm interested in optimization. And it is clear that executive 1 is suboptimally managing their workload. And at some point, there is a risk that they will drift into both fatigue and then possible burnout. The way we visualize this to executives is to ask them to self-report at the same time as we're measuring them. It's a 7-day period. And what we discover is that executives can be very inaccurate in the way they self-report. This is an executive of one of the big banks, has 2,000 people reporting to her. And she thinks the blue is her, and behind her, the sort of FT pink is her benchmark leadership group. She thinks she is pretty well in line with her peer group, if not slightly better across the 8 parameters that we measure, including sleep quality and her recovery. When we measured her, not so much. Her recovery is shockingly poor, and her ability to project performance-related stress is actually, as a result, lower than her benchmark. She was very shocked by this. But what we can show and engage with individuals is there's no right or wrong profile, but there's a combination of genetics, inherited behavior, learned behavior, but also potential for interventions. In this case, this individual has to focus on daytime recovery to rebalance and to commit to deal with the fact she just doesn't get enough sleep to generate a platform for performance. But interestingly, we also collect psychometric data alongside, and I just wanted to share this. This is a senior investment banker at one of the investment banks advising clients. And the yellow line is what we would recommend, given his profile, that he should get as hours of sleep. And it's just over 8 hours of sleep a night, we would recommend. The blue line is actually what he slept in hours. And as you can see, it dropped down to below 5 hours here. He had a peak of 9 hours here. But we've correlated that with self-reported creativity, perceived creativity. And guess what? What we see is when he only gets 5 hours sleep, he thinks he has no creativity to offer his clients. When he has 9 hours sleep and the right amount, guess what? He's up at 80% self-reported, and that's in a 1-day swing. Very self-aware and very clear that this individual needs a certain volume of sleep if he's going to deliver optimal performance. Now translate that across your workforce and the required skills and performance metrics that you may have. We believe that the PQ, the physiological quotient, is a material metric that should be added into your normal IQ and EQ concept, which is why we call it the 3Q perspective. So once we've got PQ, we integrate it. And what we have is a technology which is derived from elite sport. This is used by 550 US pro sports coaching programs and college programs. It's being used by the US Olympic team right now and the US military, where you give an individual their profile and their ability to see day by day how their key metrics perform. and you provide access for their coaches and potentially, and this is a GDPR issue, their managers to support their metric performance. I think Nick was saying he'd like to be able to understand what was going on with his people. Well, it's possible, and it's empirical. It's based in science, and it's not subjective. It challenges subjective biases, and it goes to the place where people like Daniel Kahneman talk about thinking fast and slow. You can only think slow if you're in control of your physiology. And that's the sort of bottom line. What we are trying to present here to organizations is the capacity, and that's just a very brief outline of what we do, a capacity to understand the human being more completely and the potential triggers to behavior, and integrate those metrics with the multitude of metrics you already have to find the correlations, whether it's sleep, whether it's daytime recovery. Because if you're going to spend a lot of money on a well-being program, you might as well know what individuals might as well know what will work for them before they engage in utilizing the facilities. And I think this is, again, for an ROI, for a COO, this is a way of making things relevant in the performance space, whilst at the same time enabling and empowering the individual to take responsibility for their self-management. So that's my 6 letters.
Thank you, Andrew. Nick, I'm going to turn to you on this. If we go back to your dashboard, and you've got Starling Trust on there, and you've got X, Y, Z. Playing devil's advocate, if Andrew came in to see you when you were COO, and he then presented that, where would you see that, or do you not, or do you struggle to see how that could be, how that can have a place on your dashboard in relation to your role as a COO and a leader?
I think it's really interesting. So I think it could have a place, on the dashboard. I think that, using a tool like Starling to do what we refer to as, precision management, where we can see our employees speaking up and challenging. Do my teams collaborate well? Are problems getting escalated? Are silos getting in the way? Right behaviors getting embedded? Is information getting shared? And ultimately, where do I need to focus my time? Having tools like that, I'd like, as Andrew says, I'd like to think that would have a positive impact on the well-being of my teams and my kind of like staff, and to be able to see that, the result of it in a tool that, Andrew's talking about, would be great, right? That would be the kind of, the nirvana kind of situation, right? I have the tools to be able to kind of manage with foresight and with real precision and shrink my massive kind of like haystack. My well-being should improve, and therefore the stats that Andrew is talking about should show that I get more sleep at night. But equally, so should my team, right?
So Nick, could you see yourself actually having one side it's a management tool, and it's almost like it's like an empathetic leadership tool in many ways, because you're actually saying to so right, you're not looking after yourself, and by actually having that messaging, you're going to enhance their productivity. Whereas if you help them manage their own well-being better, could you see that actually being then the data on that individual being reflected in Starling Trust, for example? You can actually how does this actually manifest itself in this person's behavior, etc.? Is that potentially, Andrew, do you see that as a link?
I do. I mean, they must answer from their perspective of Starling Trust, but the whole point of what we're trying to do is to create parameters of measurement that can integrate and be correlated and understood by a meta-analysis of the sort that Starling's describing. I mean, as my academic friends will say, correlations are interesting, causations are fundamental. And if you're running a bank, if you can discover causative relationships of risks relating to your people, or optimization possibilities relating to your people, which link to culture and decisions that are made by management and leadership, to me, that's a huge potential win. And if it's measurable empirically, with parameters that are validated, then to me, that's got to have a place in businesses that depend on their human capital.
I'm just going to bring in Patrick. I know you've got a point that Patrick just nudged me on. I'm not going to ambush it, Patrick. I'm going to let you say it because it was a good point. People realise it's not me. Patrick, what's your view in relation to the contextualizing Andrew's product? You've got a couple of points you want to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I didn't mention before is one of the things I'm involved in is the UK Finance Conduct and Culture Academy, where we look at the regulatory thrust and we try to flip it on its head and turn it into value creation. That was some of the point of what I talked about in the second slide earlier. And that's incredibly relevant because, you know, we've had Ted McDonald on one of the sessions and we talked to the regulator, we see where they're going. And we had a conversation yesterday about the senior management regime and Series 24 in the US about the responsibility of senior managers in terms of managing the organization, managing risk effectively. And certainly in the UK, that is starting to shift further. It's expanding to the point where senior managers with senior management function with that responsibility are having greater and they're expected to a greater and greater degree to be managing culture. And the regulator is recognizing that the right behavior drives a better performing business as well. And they're getting a little bit on the bandwagon about this value argument. However, on the sort of slightly sort of hidden point is that they see these technologies coming out. They see what's coming on the market. And you know, there are many others as well which can measure culture broadly and in different ways. There are lots of great products coming out. Not to disparage either of these two, which I think are absolutely brilliant. But what they're starting to think is, well, hang on a sec, with all this great stuff out there, which and the amount of money that banks are spending on technology for surveillance and monitoring and so on, if they're not spending a little bit on something which they know causatively is going to drive better performance and create a stronger culture, which is what we're all talking about, then I'm going to look pretty hard at any senior manager who's deciding not to make this part of their toolkit. And that I think we're starting to see that trend. In where the regulator may be going. It's not overt, and I don't want to set any hairs running, but certainly we are starting to see that as they start to make at least private comments on some of the technologies that's out there through the roundtables discussions that they've been having, and in some of the very sort of private and informal conversations they're having. For example, messages from the engine room when they talk to people at every single level within the organization. So you know,
I think both,
get ahead of it, get ahead of that, and start using this to drive value.
I think both actually in some ways play to different regulations. I think I can see from an SMR perspective, you can see that using both would actually turn that, and also from an operational resilience perspective. Actually, you could argue that Andrew's tool enables your leaders and actually at all levels be more resilient because you're adopting a health and care approach to it in relation to.
Absolutely.
So now we just got 7 or 8 minutes left, and I think this is great, and I could actually wax lyrical on it. I want to come back to Nick and Mark about. So how would you then summarize that? How do you create a beach landing on this? How do you actually go? How do you start building the business case? And what's the best way to actually set a precedent to build upon? From your experience, you've got the objectivity now of actually sitting outside HSBC. So what would be your guiding notes to those listening in on? They may have the intent and the interest to do this, but actually, how do they get it across the line in the beginning?
Well, I mean, from my vantage point, it's really interesting to listen to Andrew talk about, you know, the individual, the human system, and how it's important to performance. But I think that just plays to, you actually just mentioned the words I was going to use, operational resilience, and what the business leaders are being asked to do today. You know, they're under a lot of, you know, I don't have to tell everyone in this audience, they're under a lot of commercial pressure. They need to make these businesses perform. And operational resilience is about getting a positive outcome. And what we've just heard is it's not just about your systems and processes, it's about your organization at large, and the human system and its performance is key to that. So when I think about, you know, how do you bring these tools in play, you know, you're bringing them in play in a commercial way. You know, you bring them in relation to your critical businesses, and you set them up to give you an insight around those critical businesses to help those businesses perform better, but also to help ensure they don't fail. And so when we're looking at ways in which we can drive that level of, you know, responsiveness that's been asked upon us by the board and the regulators, and arguably been asked upon us by our customers, then it's about, from my perspective, it's about not bringing these tools in just to see whether or not our people are feeling good or happy. It has to be brought in very much aligned to the strategic and commercial objectives of the organization. So setting out those dashboards, looking at those factors, those human factors in relation to those operating factors, and looking at in relation to the businesses that matter and the critical services that matter, that is where actually you create a credible business case to start to deploy this type of predictive analytics. It needs to be able to make the businesses perform better and to make them less likely to fail. It needs to answer some of the challenges around things like operational resilience if it is going to get buy-in from the organization at large and the budget that we need to be able to use these type of tools going forward.
What were the challenges that you faced at HSBC, or was there a relatively easy path to engagement, or are there any lessons you can throw out about any hurdles that you came across upon reflection that you'd be able to deal with in a different way?
Where do you start? I mean, I think there's no easy way to work on the frontier of introducing some of the new tech applications that we're seeing out there, some of the new innovation that we're seeing out there. If you talk to any of the companies that are trying to work with and partner with, and it is a partnership you're looking for. These aren't plug and play. This is about both the provider of the capability and the user of that capability working together to understand their business and set out the tools to work in context of their business. You know, everyone will talk about the challenges going through procurement, the 18-month plus challenge of actually the sign-offs, people getting comfortable with how these tools need to work. But a lot of it is also about the mindset about wanting to iterate and experiment and being comfortable to try new things. And the upside for that is if you're prepared to innovate, you're prepared to try new things, there is a step change in capability that's now out there because of the digital revolution, the technological revolution we're seeing, and our ability to use data from distributed sources at scale we haven't been able to use before and apply computational capability to it in a way that we've never been able to apply before. If you embrace that, you get a massive step up. But it isn't a simple go in, plug, play, go.
What do you reckon the time span is in relation to a return on that investment? As in, a return on investment, as in you're starting to see some form of, you can see a tangible benefit, or you can start to understand and frame the benefit.
I think, as we see that, just general, the challenges on today's banks and insurers to streamline, to be more efficient, more effective, but at the same time to really digitalize their businesses. If you don't start embracing some of these technologies to make sense of that complex environment, then I think it's very hard to optimize and make these businesses work in the way that's intended. But I think also there's a lot of vulnerability that is not being adequately addressed. And I suppose when you talk about how quickly can you get a return in terms of traditional improved sales performance, I think when you start to see teams that are not coming together well, or you're not getting disconnect in terms of the operational side versus the relationship side, then you can turn around those things relatively rapidly, and that certainly can then that will translate through in terms of sales. But the more broader element of just making these businesses work better and be more resilient, again, trying to put a traditional return number on that and how quickly to return is quite difficult. But I think you can get a level of insight quite quickly that is difficult to get otherwise, that adds real value to a business very, very quickly.
Thank you, Mark. Patrick, one quick point for you, then I'm going to ask Nick to close from the first line of the COO perspective. You're on mute, Patrick.
Thank you. And it does take us back to the whole point and the point of the summit about purpose and culture, how we can connect everything. And when we look at these sorts of tools, this is where we're getting down into the nitty-gritty. And it's essentially, we've seen that people perform when they feel listened to and valued, part of that motivation element, as well as being given the tools and the right purpose. So it's kind of how we listen very, very carefully. And I'll say this, only once we connect the dots between the metrics, the behaviors, the reward framework and purpose, can we really say that culture is going to drive value in our organization? So really putting this as part of a full continuum and a framework of the organization, we really have the leverage to make real difference in the organization, I think.
Thank you. Nick, I'll come to you at the end because you are you're a kindred spirit to most of those listening. You've very recently, you were a principal executive COO. What's the words of counsel you get in relation to being a convertee into the world of the possibilities of technology, and whether it's Starling Trust or other? How would you summarize your thoughts in relation to how any of your peers could best engage on this and to what benefit?
So I think I can't remember the actual chief executive, but it was the chief executive of a big US retail bank or retail focused bank that got into a lot of regulatory difficulty fairly recently, who said, I don't know why people behave like they do, which was, which is staggering nowadays, right? Because, the point is that now you can work out why people behave like they do. You've got the tools to be able to gain those kind of insights. And you asked a little bit about what the benefits, might be. To be slightly cheeky, the initial benefit is the regulator will love it. I think Patrick kind of touched on that earlier on, right? The regulators are desperate for people and banks and operations to start thinking about this ongoing, problem, which is hard to manage, to think about it in a different way. And to be really cheeky, if you go onto the Starling Trust website and have a look at the compendium, which is a kind of a book of kind of thought leadership that Starling puts together, you'll see contributions from regulators basically desperate for this kind of stuff to be embraced, in anger, right? They really want banks to try and think about how to manage their people, to think about how and why people behave, and to use the data to do that, to manage with foresight. And the tools are there now. But Mark also stressed a very important point. This isn't plug and play. This does require embracing it, partnering and learning with the technology and iterating with it over time. And Starling uses machine learning techniques. There is a learning part to this, right? That needs to, to develop over time. And these products will get better and better with the more data they're given. So that would be my closing kind of, wish that, we embrace this. And the immediate uplift is the regulators will start to be more delighted.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your contributions. Really appreciate it. Very interesting. I think hopefully it's prompted some thought with those. Just one closing comment came from Chris Tatum, about Steve Wowen, that's a former Army officer similar to myself. He was talking around you about your products in relation to the complexity of it is fantastic, but actually the output of it is an old Army adage of fitting body, fitting mind. So you can look at it and go, actually, that's common sense, isn't it? But actually the complexity of the science that you put behind it to enable us to get to that point of course, if we look after our people, they're going to be better performance, better productivity, better profitability. But as my father used to say, the wonderful thing about common sense is not very common. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your contributions. Thank you, viewers, for listening. I think we've got one more this evening and then day 3 tomorrow. Look forward to hopefully speaking to a few